So this business of um, what makes poverty poverty is a really good question. And the the way we judge economic values and the way the economic rules have changed is a really important consideration. The fact is that nobody can afford to really farm the way my grandparents farmed anymore. They raised families on those family farms. In my grandparents' case, a sizable family. And they were all fine and happy. And while there was never, an abundance of money, there was always enough money. And they would have never have thought of themselves as being in poverty. Nowadays, if you would see a family like that, you would think of them as being in poverty. The standards have shifted. The standards have changed.
So that says that very well.
Yeah. And that's what made me say all that.
I understand.
The extremes in wealth and poverty today, the extremes in wealth especially, are something we have not seen since the age of the robber barons. That's another thing that's just gotten way out of alignment in our contemporary society. When you think of the number of billionaires and how much money $1 billion is, that's $1,000 million. That's a staggering amount of money. And when you think about the people who have multiple billions of dollars, well, other people are scrambling just to get by. There's something wrong with that picture.
Definitely. I've always wondered how it is that they actually calculate that, because, even here in America, where we are excessively wealthy compared to most of the world, and I know that. But for example, I've been dealing with insurance things and see that what's considered the poverty level in California for two people is below $17,000 a year. And I just can't really figure out how that's calculated, because I can't really see how two people could live in California on that. I mean, I don't know, but
maybe maybe in needles.
Well, even then, it's almost like, sure, if that covers your rent and maybe some of your groceries, but I do my predominant shopping at the 99-cent store. I live on an extremely low food budget, but still, I just can't imagine two people. I don't know. But anyway, so I'm just wondering who comes up with that number. Like, what were the factors that they put into that equation? And then when you think of that in terms of relative to the multiple billionaires who also live in California, it's exactly what you're saying, Steve. It's just like, it's insane.
Well, and there's the context question again too, because when you think of the entire state of California, California is a huge place with a lot of communities and a lot of different economic zones within all of those communities. So to say what the poverty level is for the state of California is a little bit ridiculous. Just as to say what it is for the United States is a little bit ridiculous, because what will buy you reasonable lodging in one place won't cover anything in another place. What will buy you a reasonable meal in one place won't buy you anything in another place. I look at what my cousins pay for their absolutely gorgeous houses in Bella Vista, Arkansas.
Mhm.
And you couldn't buy anything in Long Beach for that.
Mhm.
But again, this is just the life we live. That's why the economic rules that we play by and the economic standards that we judge things by are kind of broken, because we have these yardsticks that don't really work.
Well, and I like that he uses the phrase, the context of, besides the concrete historical periods, Bob. He says the context of actual opportunities available, which to me is a very different measure than, you know, what's on what basis survival is considered possible. You know,
Right.
opportunities available is a very different.
Shall we?
Regarding where those guidelines come from, it's the Federal Department of Health and Human Services creates them, and I think it's a national. And what I'm looking at is for the 48 contiguous states and District of Columbia. So I think one of the reasons, Ellen, that it's so low is that it's a national rather than regional.
Why would they even use that? It's crazy. Even more crazy.
For the reason they do it, of course, is for federal programs. Is that, for instance,
Sure.
when people come into legal aid, one of the first things they ask is you know what their income is, so that because if it's below a certain level, the legal aid gets a grant. So anyway.
Right, that makes sense. Thank you.
Shall we move to the next item?
Yes, please.
It frequently becomes clear that in practice, human rights are not equal for all. Well, that's just what we were talking about. Respect for those rights is the preliminary condition for a country's social and economic development. When the dignity of the human person is respected and his or her rights recognized and guaranteed, creativity and interdependence thrive, and the creativity of the human personality is released through actions that further the common good. Yet by closely observing our contemporary societies, we see numerous contradictions that lead us to wonder whether the equal dignity of all human beings, solemnly proclaimed 70 years ago, is truly recognized, respected, protected, and promoted in every situation. In today's world, many forms of injustice persist, fed by reductive anthropological visions and by a profit-based economic model that does not hesitate to exploit, discard, and even kill human beings. While one part of humanity lives in opulence, another part sees its own dignity denied, scorned, or trampled upon, and its fundamental rights discarded or violated. What does this tell us about the equality of rights grounded in innate human dignity? I'm looking up the footnote 19. Anybody
Many
want
of
to?
the references are, sorry, previous encyclicals or talks that he's given.
That was from a message to the participants in the International Conference, Human Rights in the Contemporary World, Achievements, Omissions, Negations, December 2018, L'Osservatore Romano. So there's that. Human rights are not equal for all. Anybody want to comment on that? It seems to me this is what Black Lives Matter is all about.
Mm-hmm.
That's been the essential message of it.
That's true.
I guess what I see is the inherent truth of the next section, that there's a reward, a value to providing, widespread respect.
Yeah. Yeah. Shall we move on to the next section? I mean, I think we kind of all agree with the truth of that one we just read, that some people are more equal than others. Similarly, the organization of societies worldwide is still far from reflecting clearly that women possess the same dignity and identical rights as men. We say one thing with words, but our decisions and reality tell another story. Indeed, doubly poor are those women who endure situations of exclusion, mistreatment, and violence, since they're frequently less able to defend their rights. Yep.
No argument there.
But isn't that exactly what the Roman Catholic Church is doing to women? I mean, they're saying women possess the same dignity and identical rights as men, but they're not acknowledged within the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, and Francis has been trying to push that envelope ever so carefully from within. I don't envy him. He's in a hard spot because he gets so much pushback on things like that.
Well, men have a lot to lose as a result.
Right.
Yes.
And it's an entirely male-dominated power structure in the Vatican and in the Roman Church. So every time he makes the slightest remark that indicates he's moving in that direction of empowering women to do more things, he's got cardinals and Benedict and other people just, getting their cassocks in a knot. And that's a lot of loud voices for him to overcome. But that he'll sit down and write something like this to make it clear that he thinks it needs to be addressed. So hooray for him.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of thing too, that if he were to simply proclaim it by fiat, it would completely split the church. So he treads ever so delicately. And then that's, I think, one of the reasons he continues to embrace dialogue with people like the Lutherans and other Protestants. Because he can point to us and say, see, it's working here and it's not destroying the world. We should also recognize that even though the international community, oh, wait, I want to say one more thing about that. I think the joy that we have seen in Kamala Harris being the vice president-elect, just the enormous celebration that we've seen as a result of that should tell us something.
No, we're so far behind. How many other developed nations have had female leaders long before we even got to this?
Yeah. You think of all the nations who have had women leaders, and we haven't yet. I mean,
That's what I was saying.
what's wrong with this picture?
Mhm.
India has, Pakistan has.
Mhm.
For crying out loud, why aren't we in that picture? New Zealand, Germany, Australia, Great Britain, decades ago.
Mhm.
And what's wrong with us?
The boys are threatened.
Even in the ELCA, women clergy make 86 cents on every dollar that male clergy make.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
I thought that was only in the business world. I didn't realize it related to clergy too. Boo hiss.
Yeah.
Isn't that still, I have such little knowledge, but isn't that still something that has been in the House for ages and we still haven't ratified that equal pay for women?
Rights Amendment. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, seriously?
It's still a national norm. That's something that needs to get fixed.
Yeah. We need to get over ourselves.
Yeah. When I was in that nonviolence workshop with Dr. James, oh, I'm blanking on his last name, civil rights leader who was with Dr. Martin Luther King. Oh man, he's legendary, and I'm blanking on his name. Anyway, he said, for this country to really move forward, the first thing we need to do is to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Anyway, let's keep moving. We should also recognize that even though the international community has adopted numerous agreements aimed at ending slavery in all its forms and has launched various strategies to combat this phenomenon, millions of people today, children, women, and men of all ages, are deprived of freedom and forced to live in conditions akin to slavery. Today, as in the past, slavery is rooted in a notion of the human person that allows him or her to be treated as an object. Whether by coercion or deception, or by physical or psychological duress, human persons created in the image and likeness of God are deprived of their freedom, sold and reduced to being the property of others. They are treated as means to an end. Criminal networks are skilled in using modern means of communication as ways of luring young men and women in various parts of the world. A perversion that exceeds all limits when it subjugates women and then forces them to abort. An abomination that goes to the length of kidnapping persons for the sake of selling their organs. Trafficking in persons and other contemporary forms of enslavement are a worldwide problem that needs to be taken seriously by humanity as a whole. Since criminal organizations employ global networks to achieve their goals, efforts to eliminate this phenomenon also demand a common and indeed a global effort on the part of various sectors of society. Oh, that's just such a sad commentary on humanity.
And all of that is true.
Yeah.
That entire paragraph says whole lifetime's worth of problems.
Yeah. Well, it's part of the problem that develops out of considering persons as commodities, as either assets or liabilities, rather than as human beings, as fellow entities, persons worthy of existence.
Pack animal.
Yeah. Who would like to read the next paragraph?
I'll do that. War, terrorist attacks, racial or religious persecution, and many other affronts to human dignity are judged differently depending on how convenient it proves for certain primarily economic interests. What is true as long as it is convenient for someone in power stops being true once it becomes inconvenient. These situations of violence, sad to say, have become so common as to constitute a real Third World War fought piecemeal.
Oh, that's putting it kind of starkly.
Yeah,
That we have for quite a while now been in the midst of a third world war that's being fought piecemeal.
Yep.
Powerful phrase.
It's similar to what George Orwell described in 1984.
Oh gosh. It's been so long since I read that book,
Oh, I don't remember it.
1983. This should not be surprising if we realize that we no longer have common horizons that unite us. Indeed, the first victim of every war is the human family's innate vocation to fraternity. As a result, every threatening situation breeds mistrust and leads people to withdraw into their own safety zone. Our world is trapped in a strange contradiction. We believe that we can ensure stability and peace through a false sense of security sustained by a mentality of fear and mistrust. Wow, that's heavy, man.
Well, let's sit with that a minute.
Yeah, right. Woo.
There has to be an us and a them. We believe we can ensure stability and peace through a false sense of security sustained by a mentality of fear and mistrust.
– That just sounds so backwards, doesn't it? How can you ensure stability and peace with that? You can't.
With fear and
You can't do it, can you? It doesn't make sense to me.
Go back to 15 for a second. The best way to dominate and gain control over people is to spread despair and discouragement, even under the guise of defending certain values.
Yep.
Yeah, those really tie in well together, don't they?
Right. So if you're creating a mentality of fear and distrust, you're setting the stage for despair and discouragement.
Yeah.
You're setting the stage to set yourself up or somebody up
Right.
as someone who can control things, take the reins, provide the safety. So it sets the stage for a presentation of a power structure or a person who can be the savior.
Wow.
The footnote on this is, interestingly, the address on nuclear weapons in Nagasaki, Japan.
Really?
Number 25.
Yeah. Well, and what's been the operating structure for our handling of nuclear weapons throughout the world? It's a wonderful acronym, MAD.
Mad?
Mutually assured destruction. That's been the way that the world has maintained its balance of power with nuclear weapons. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction.
Mm.
and in this country, the sense that the more we have, the more secure we are. When what we have is just so ridiculously in excess of anything that we would ever be able to use, as it were. It's just it's exactly what this is saying. It's that sense of military strength is based on fear and mistrust, right?
Right. So if Russia or China builds a new weapon, then we have to build one.
Right.
Or if we build a new one, then they have to build one.
Yeah.
So does that extend to viruses and chemical warfare, such as some of that nerve, it wasn't a nerve gas, but a nerve agent that one Russian that was going against Putin, he was poisoned with that?
Yes.
That the Russians.
Mhm.
So are we doing the same thing? We just don't hear about it?
Theoretically, by international agreement, those things have been outlawed.
Right. But they're
Theoretically.
Yeah, right.
yeah, talk about
America's
weapons.
attitude is generally it's okay for us to have it, just nobody else can have it.
Right, but now it seems like it's okay for Russia and China,
North Korea.
I mean,
Well, this is why North Korea is called a rogue state, because they never signed on to any of these agreements.
yeah.
They've never signed on to any nuclear non-proliferation agreements. They've never signed on to any agreements to ban chemical or biological agents.
So I would call these weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah, scary stuff. That's, one of the very first questions, and of course, one of the very first big rumors about COVID-19 was that it had escaped from a lab somewhere and that it was actually a biological warfare agent that the Chinese had accidentally or on purpose released, which, has been disproven, but of course the rumor keeps circulating. Just because we live in an age now where we know it's possible to create those kinds of things. Fun times.
Compared to the Russian, what was it, the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Right.
When you think about that in comparison to today, that seems just like small potatoes. I'm sure it wasn't at the time, but.
Well, it didn't seem like it when I was hiding under my desk.
Like that was going to do any good.
Yeah. I remember being scared to death during those days.
Yeah.
Can you imagine how the people in Florida felt?
Oh, no kidding.
90 miles away?
Yeah. Margie, you want to keep reading?
This should not be surprising if we realize that we no longer have common horizons that unite us. Indeed, the first victim.
That's the one we just did. Yeah, go to 27.
Right.
But she froze.
Oops.
Margie.
Margie Brown just turned into a princess. She's frozen.
Yep.
That's right.
Okay. I'll read.
You are.
Does somebody else want to read?
Sure. This should not be surprising if we realize.
Wait, we're on 27.
We're on 20.
Okay. Paradoxically, we have certain ancestral fears that technological development has not succeeded in eliminating. Indeed, those fears have been able to hide and spread behind new technologies. Today, too, outside the ancient town walls lies the abyss, the territory of the unknown, the wilderness. Whenever it comes from there cannot be trusted, for it is unknown, unfamiliar, not part of the village. It is the territory of the barbarian from whom we must defend ourselves at all costs. As a result, new walls are erected for self-preservation. The outside world ceases to exist and leaves only my world, to the point that others, no longer considered human beings, possessed of an inalienable dignity, becomes only them. Once more, we encounter the temptation to build a culture of walls, to raise walls, walls in the heart, walls on the land, in order to prevent this encounter with other cultures, with other people. And those who raise walls will end up as slaves within the very walls they have built. They are left without horizons, for they lack this interchange with others.
Wow, and that has got to be one of the great ironies of our age, when we have communication tools we never had before, when we have the ability to interface with people electronically on the other side of the world, when we have abilities to travel and communicate with people, that it's just extraordinary that we find ourselves increasing our isolation. It's mind-boggling, really, that we've managed to pull ourselves apart from each other so much. I remember when I was younger, I used to go back and forth to Mexico all the time. Heck, when I was 17, I went to Colombia.
Yeah.
And we used to think nothing of it, and felt completely safe. And I had friends from Mexico that would come here, and it was no big deal. And farm workers went back and forth, and it was easy and no big deal. And yeah, okay, so everybody who came across wasn't legal necessarily, but it wasn't that big a deal. And it worked. And suddenly
it's become a political tool to create us and them.
Because of fear and mistrust.
Yep.
it's a big deal, and it doesn't work. And we got, yeah. It's frustrating. It's sad.
And now we're creating it between red states and blue states, us and them, even within our own nation.
Right.
Yeah.
Hopefully we've turned the corner.
I sure hope so. In my prayers.
Start back the right direction. Unite.
But actually, that division is being noticed in terms of things that we have to do to draw those people in. And so, all right.
But then I think we also need to look at the socioeconomic separations, because they're starting, that's becoming an us and them issue also. Those
Right.
that are poor versus those that are middle class versus those that are wealthy. That's another political tool that's used for fear and control.
That's right.
Shall I go on?
Mhm.
The loneliness, fear, and insecurity experienced by those who feel abandoned by the system creates a fertile terrain for various mafias. These flourish because they claim
That's
to be
true that we live, because
These flourish because they claim to be defenders of the forgotten, often by providing various forms of assistance, even as they pursue their criminal interests. There also exists a typical mafioso pedagogy that, by appealing to a false communitarian mystique, creates bonds of dependency and fealty upon which it is difficult to break free.
I'm sorry, my internet connection went wacky. We're having problems in our neighborhood.
Mine went wacky when I was reading. That's why I got it.
And we're glad you're back, Margie.
Yes.
Where
you were there,
were
but you weren't there.
We just finished reading 28.
So it seems like this is just, I mean, we looked at it, the Pope is looking at it from a broad worldwide impact, and now he's bringing it down to almost just even your immediate community has these us and them issues and feelings of being walled off or needing security within just your neighborhood, you know, your local neighborhood. So I think that's interesting how he brought that down. So it's very basic. Is that how does everybody else see it?
Well, that's what I saw before we even got to this paragraph was we do live with a lot of fear amongst our own states and counties about the city we live in and where it's okay to be and where it's not okay to be. You know, in essence, across the tracks, you know, they live on the other side of the tracks. There's places you just should not go, especially in the middle of the night, but
yep.
And it's scary. It's sad.
Yeah. I wonder if I mean, we're more of an urban or city environment, but is this also apply to rural communities? Are rural communities like this? I know they don't trust city folk, but does anybody have an experience with the rural communities or heard anything?
Yes, it continues, and that's where the expression "the other side of the tracks" came from. You know, one side was the wealthier, and the poorer folks were relegated to the other side of the tracks.
There was a really good article in the LA Times this past weekend about how there's this divide in Lodi. And it's there's been a fracture in the community of Lodi, which is pretty agrarian, with blue versus red. And then my cousin is the mayor of Jasper, Arkansas. And she's been lamenting the red-blue divide in her little town in Jasper, Arkansas, because it's normally a pretty harmonious place. And they are still managing to get along in a pretty harmonious way. And yet she's seeing this fracture, this divide, where people are a lot more tentative and cautious around each other than they used to be. And so she's trying to create community events where they can find ways to bypass these kinds of divisiveness and get past all this. Yeah, where they can kind of start seeing each other as neighbors again. It's tense times.
And what strikes me here is that, you know, the Pope has already said that, you know, those people that wall themselves off become slaves within that community or within those walls. And what he's saying here is, and those people that are on the other side of the wall are subject to, you know, being pulled into, you know, a mafioso type relationship. It also occurs to me that this is exactly how we find, you know, our runaways, or, you know, children basically lured into sexual relationships. Yeah. Yeah, so they're abandoned at home. Then somebody comes along that pays attention to them and wants to take care of them and promises to take care of them.
Yeah. Okay.
Shall I read more?
Sure.
Okay.
Globalization and progress without a shared roadmap, number 29. With the Grand Imam, Ahmed Al-Taib, we do not ignore the positive advances made in areas of science, technology, medicine, industry, and welfare, above all in developed countries. Nonetheless, we wish to emphasize that together with these historical advances, great and valued as they are, there exists a moral deterioration that influences international action and a weakening of spiritual values and responsibility. This contributes to a general feeling of frustration, isolation, and desperation. We see outbreaks of tension and a buildup of arms and ammunition in the global context dominated by uncertainty, disillusionment, fear of the future, and controlled by narrow economic interests. We can also point to major political crises, situations of injustice, and the lack of an equitable distribution of natural resources. In the face of such crises that result in the deaths of millions of children, emaciated from poverty and hunger, there is an unacceptable silence on the international level. This panorama, for all its undeniable advances, does not appear to lead to a more humane future.
Wow.
That's understatement, isn't it? That last sentence.
Boy. Oof.
So the technology gets better, but the moral character gets worse.
Yeah. Moral deterioration, which influences action. Wow. Oof. Scary.
Awakening of spiritual values and responsibility. That is such an important piece that's missing so often. Responsibility. I would need to think about it a lot more, but I'm tempted to try to make a case that responsibility is, in fact, a spiritual value. A sense of responsibility is a spiritual value. We hear a lot of people talking about their rights, especially with the issue when the issue of wearing masks has been, such an issue. And
what right is that?
I always get frustrated when people talk about their rights without talking about their responsibilities, because rights should always carry with them responsibilities. That's part of the moral equation. And I think that's something that the founders in writing the Constitution understood, but that didn't get well communicated down the pipeline. At least doesn't seem to be well understood by a lot of people in our generation. So, and we see that expressed in a lot of ways. You see people who want to make a big deal about their Second Amendment right to own firearms, but don't want to talk too much about their responsibility in owning those firearms and how they're maintained and handled and how the safety is maintained. And never mind, I'm going to preach. Stop. I'll stop.
But you're right. Because I mean, when you raise it, go ahead.
Go ahead, Bob. I'm sorry.
When you raise the question of responsibility, I always go to, who is my brother? And
right.
Well, I think a really timely example of that is that, the counterpart is the right to vote. And isn't there also then a responsibility to vote?
Yeah. And a responsibility to vote responsibly.
Not only responsibly, but thoughtfully. I mean,
Right.
really think about the consequences of your action by voting, by what you're voting for or voting against.
And not just how will this affect my pocketbook, but how will this affect the world? How will this affect the way laws are made? How will this affect the environment? How will this affect, I mean, it requires deep critical thought. And we have a responsibility to do that thinking before we mark our ballots.
I like your statement of deep critical thought. I'm wondering if that should almost be, I think that's something that's missing from the school system. I think I don't know if we ever used to have that, but I think deep critical thought should almost be a class or integrated into many levels of, or grades of I guess, grade levels of classes, of schoolrooms. We need Maryland. We need Maryland.
You see, Steph, you raise an interesting question because an issue, but I can tell you that I know Cal State, the Cal State system has come up with something called the Keystone, and so what happens is that across all the courses is that they expect a certain level of thinking to be evident in the form of certain keystone papers that have to be produced, and they're distributed through the various classes.
That's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. But it seems it would be better to start integrating that at lower levels, high school, junior high school. I mean, even simple critical thinking for first graders.
Yeah.
And it's not just a responsibility of schools. I don't mean to dump that all on teachers, but families too. But I don't know that a lot of families know how to do that, to pass that on.
Do we
I hate
really
to
want
do
teenagers
this.
thinking for themselves?
Oh, yes, we do. If they're going to do it critically and deeply, yes. I hate to do this, but I have to run. I have appointments in LA. So
Okay.
thank you.
Be safe.